Cathvari had served aboard the Endless Calculation for 47 cycles, and all that time she had never once felt like she truly existed to anyone but herself. She was a Marishi, one of the small gray-skinned species that the galaxy had long ago decided were useful but utterly unremarkable. The Marishi had large dark eyes that reflected light like pools of black water and delicate antennae that rose from their foreheads and betrayed every emotion they tried to hide. They were efficient workers, and they never complained, and they kept the great machines of civilization running smoothly. They were also completely and totally forgettable. This was not an insult that other species hurled at them in anger. It was simply a fact that everyone accepted, including the Marishi themselves. Something about their faces refused to stick in the memory of other beings. Something about their voices faded from recollection moments after they stopped speaking. Something about their names slipped away like water through open fingers. Cathvari worked in atmospheric maintenance on Deck 17 of the station. It was a massive, sprawling level where dozens of species passed through every day, breathing the air she kept clean and safe. Without ever once looking down to see who made it possible, she checked the filtration systems and monitored the oxygen levels and repaired the broken vents and filed her reports with perfect accuracy. The work was essential to the survival of everyone on the station. The work was also completely invisible, just like her. In 47 cycles, she had introduced herself perhaps 300 times. She had spoken her name clearly and carefully to supervisors who nodded and then called her, "You there?" The very next day, she had told her name to colleagues who smiled politely and then asked, "What was it again?" Before she had even finished her sentence, she had written her name on reports that the maintenance chief signed without ever once reading the signature line. Not a single being had ever remembered her name by their second meeting. Not one. She had stopped correcting them 20 cycles ago, because what was the point of insisting on a name that would only dissolve in their minds like morning mist? Now she simply answered to whatever they called her. Marishi was common. "You there" was frequent. "Hey" was the most popular. Sometimes they did not call her anything at all and simply pointed or gestured or waited for her to notice that they wanted something. She had learned to pay attention to the pointing and the gesturing because it was the only way to know when she was needed. Her quarters were small and bare because she had never seen the purpose in decorating a space that no one would ever visit. She ate her meals alone in the corner of the commissary because no one ever thought to invite her to join them. She walked through the corridors like a ghost passing through walls because the crowds parted around her without ever registering that she was there. This was her life, and she had made peace with it long ago. Or at least she had convinced herself that she had made peace with it. The truth was that somewhere deep inside her chest there was a hollow, aching place that never stopped hurting. It was the place where her name should have lived in someone else's memory. It was empty, and it had always been empty, and she had accepted that it would always be empty. Then the human arrived. His name was Samuel Reeves, and he came to Deck 17 on a cold station morning when the recycled air carried that particular staleness that meant the filters needed changing. Cathvari knew his name because she always learned names. It was a small rebellion she had maintained for all 47 cycles. If no one would remember her, then she would remember everyone. It was a way of proving to herself that forgetting was a choice and not an inevitability. Samuel Reeves was assigned to waste reclamation, which was a job even lower in the station hierarchy than atmospheric maintenance. He was tall for a human with brown skin and dark hair that curled close to his skull, and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He smiled a great deal, which Cathvari found unsettling. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, and they had a reputation for being loud and curious and strangely warm. They asked too many questions and they stood too close when they talked, and they insisted on making eye contact in ways that other species found uncomfortable. Cathvari did not know what to make of them, and she did not particularly try to figure it out. They were just another species that would forget her name, and she had long ago stopped expecting anything different on his first day. She approached him as was protocol and delivered her standard introduction. "I am HFY," she said in her quiet voice that always seemed to fade before it reached anyone's ears. "I maintain the atmospheric systems on this deck, and if you notice any fluctuations in air quality in your sector, please file a report with my department." The human looked at her, not through her, the way most beings did, at her his eyes focused on her face and stayed there, and his head tilted slightly to one side, like he was genuinely listening. "HFY," he repeated, and his pronunciation was surprisingly accurate for a species with such clumsy tongues. "Got it, and thank you for keeping us all breathing down here." She blinked. Most beings did not thank her for the air. They simply breathed it and assumed it would always be there the same way. They assumed the gravity would always work, and the lights would always turn on. "You are welcome," she said, because she did not know what else to say. Then she turned and walked away and thought nothing more of it. He seemed attentive, but they always seemed attentive at first. The forgetting would come later, it always did. She returned to her work and checked her filtration systems and monitored her oxygen levels and filed her reports with perfect accuracy. She ate her meals alone and walked through the corridors like a ghost and slept in her small bare quarters. 3 weeks passed and she did not see Samuel Reeves again because their work schedules did not overlap, and Deck 17 was large enough the two beings could go months without crossing paths. She forgot that she had met him, or rather she filed him away in the part of her mind where she kept all the names she had learned. He was just another entry in her private catalog of beings who would never remember her. She did not expect anything to change. She had stopped expecting things to change a very long time ago, but change was coming for HFY whether she expected it or not. It arrived on an ordinary afternoon in the form of heavy footsteps echoing through the maintenance corridor where she worked alone. It arrived in the shape of a human voice calling out a name that no one ever called. It arrived, and it shattered 47 cycles of careful resignation into 1,000 glittering pieces. She just did not know it yet. The filtration node on Corridor 7 had been giving her trouble for 3 days, and HFY had finally decided to open it up and examine the internal components. She knelt on the cold metal floor with her tools spread around her and her hands deep inside the machinery. The work was delicate and required her full concentration, and so she did not hear the footsteps approaching until they were very close. They were heavy footsteps with a steady rhythm that echoed off the narrow corridor. Walls human footsteps. She did not look up because she was focused on a particularly stubborn valve connection, and because she had no reason to think that any human would be looking for her. "Hey, HFY." The words hit her like a physical force, and she went completely still. Her hands stopped moving inside the machine. Her antenna froze in place. Her breath caught in her throat and refused to continue. She did not turn around because he could not possibly be talking to her. No one ever talked to her using that name. He must be speaking to someone else. There must be another being in this corridor that she had not noticed. "HFY," the voice said again, and it was closer now and tinged with something that might have been concern. "Are you okay?" Slowly and with great effort, she pulled her hands out of the filtration node slowly, and with her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her antenna. She turned around. Samuel Reeves stood 3 meters away. He was holding 2 steaming containers, and his face wore an expression that she could not immediately identify. His eyes were focused on her, and there was no confusion in them. No searching look of someone trying to remember where they had seen a face before. He knew exactly who she was. "You," she said, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. "You know my name." The human's expression shifted into something like puzzlement. "Yeah," he said, slowly, like he was not sure why this was surprising. "You told me your first day I got here in HFY." Atmospheric systems file reports if I notice any fluctuations. He smiled that crinkling smile. I have a pretty good memory. Ferrari stared at him. Translator must be malfunctioning. That was the only explanation that made any sense. The words he was speaking could not possibly mean what they seemed to mean. You remembered, she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth, like a language she had forgotten how to speak. Was I not supposed to? Samuel asked, and he took a step closer still. Holding those two steaming containers. I brought you some tea, by the way, or well, it is not really tea. It is that Kellic stuff from the commissary, but it is warm, and I noticed you are always working down here in the cold sections, so I thought you might like something to warm you up. He held out one of the containers toward her. Cathvari looked at it. She looked at his hand holding it. She looked at his face with its easy smile and its complete lack of confusion. In 47 cycles, no one had ever brought her anything. No one had ever noticed that she worked in the cold sections. No one had ever thought about whether she might like something warm. Why? She heard herself ask. Why what? Samuel said. Why would you bring me this? The humans. Smile faltered slightly, and something complicated moved behind his eyes. Because we are co-workers, he said. And because I saw you down here last week, and you look cold, and because that is just what you do right when you notice someone could use something nice. He was still holding out the container. Cathvari reached out and took it with hands that trembled slightly. The container was warm against her gray fingers. She could not remember the last time she had held something warm. Thank you, she said, and her voice cracked on the word. Samuel nodded, and then he did something that no one had ever done in 47 cycles of her life on this station. He sat down right there on the cold metal floor of the corridor. He lowered himself down and crossed his legs and took a sip from his own container, like this was the most natural thing in the world. Mind if I take a break here? He asked. Waste reclamation is pretty rough work, and I could use a few minutes off my feet. Cathvari did not know what to say. She did not know what to do. She had no experience with beings who remembered her name and brought her warm drinks and sat down beside her like they wanted to stay. I do not mind, she managed to say. She lowered herself back down to the floor, still clutching the warm container. They sat in silence for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between two beings who are simply sharing space without needing to fill it with words. So what is wrong with the filtration node? Samuel asked, eventually nodding toward the open panel. There is a valve connection that has corroded, Cathvari said. The recycled air carries trace minerals that build up over time, and the valves were not designed to handle long-term exposure. That sounds frustrating. It is, she admitted. I have requested replacement parts, but the requisition department does not prioritize atmospheric maintenance. Samuel frowned. That seemed short-sighted, given that we all need to breathe. Yes, Cathvari agreed. It does seem short-sighted. And then something extraordinary happened. She laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than a breath, but it was genuine, and it surprised her so much that she almost dropped her container. Samuel grinned at her. See, that was not so hard, was it? What was not so hard? Having a conversation, he said. You seem like you do not do it very often. Her antenna drooped slightly. I do not have many opportunities to practice. Well, Samuel said, and he raised his container in a small salute. Consider this an open invitation to practice whenever you want, and I am usually in Waste Reclamation Sector 3, but I take my breaks here because it is quieter and the air smells better. Thanks to you. He remembered her name. He had noticed where she worked. He knew that the air smelled better in her section because she maintained it properly. He had been paying attention to her. The hollow aching place inside her chest felt strange, and she realized after a moment that it was because something small and warm had taken root there. It was not much. It was just a warm drink and a few minutes of conversation, but it was more than anyone had given her in 47 cycles. I would like That, she said quietly. The practicing, I mean. Samuel smiled and finished his drink and stood up and brushed off his work suit. Same time tomorrow then, he said. I will bring the Kellic, and you can tell me more about corroded valves, and we will call it a cultural exchange. He walked away down the corridor, whistling some human tune that she did not recognize. Echevarry sat on the cold floor, holding her warm container and staring at the space where he had been. Her hands were still trembling. Her antennae were quivering with emotions she could not name. She had spent 47 cycles believing that she was forgettable. She had accepted it as a fundamental truth of her existence. But Samuel Reeves had remembered her name, and he was coming back. Tomorrow she did not know what to do with this information. She did not know how to process it or where to put it in her understanding of the universe, so she did the only thing she knew how to do. She went back to work on the filtration node. But for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel quite so alone. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Kethvari had ever experienced in her long and quiet life. Samuel Reeves did come back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. He brought warm Kellic, and he sat on the cold floor. And he talked to her like she was someone worth talking to. He asked her questions about her work, and he actually listened to the answers. He remembered the things she told him, and he brought them up again in later conversations. He learned that she preferred the night shifts because the quarters were quieter, and he started adjusting his breaks to match her schedule. He discovered that her home world had 3 moons that rose in sequence each night, and he asked her to describe what that looked like. He found out that she was teaching herself to read human poetry because she found it fascinating, and he brought her a data chip loaded with collections that he thought she might enjoy. Every single time he saw her, he said her name. Good morning, Kethvari. How is the filtration system today, Kethvari? I found this poem and I thought of you, Kethvari. Each time he said it, something small and bright flickered to life inside her chest. Each time he remembered something about her, the hollow aching place grew a little smaller. She began to look forward to their meetings in a way that frightened her. She began to listen for his footsteps in the corridor. She began to think about things she might tell him the next time she saw him. This was dangerous, and she knew it. This was hoping, and hoping had never led anywhere good for a Mareshi. But she could not seem to stop. 3 months after their first real conversation, she finally asked him the question that had been building inside her since the beginning. They were sitting in their usual spot in the maintenance corridor, sharing a container of Kellic and watching the status lights blink on the atmospheric readouts. Samuel was telling her about something called baseball, which seemed to involve hitting a ball with a stick and running in circles for reasons she did not entirely understand. She was not really listening. She was working up the courage to ask Samuel, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. He stopped talking immediately and looked at her with those attentive human eyes. What is it? Why do you do this? He tilted his head in that way he did when he was confused. Do what? Remember me, she said, and the words came faster now, tumbling out like they had been waiting 47 cycles to be spoken. Learn things about me and bring me Kellic and speak to me as though I am. She stopped because she did not know how to finish the sentence. Samuel was quiet for a moment. As though you are a person, he offered gently. Her antenna pressed flat against her skull, which was the Mareshi equivalent of flinching. The Mareshi are not memorable, she said, and she was reciting something that had been told to her so many times it had become part of her own thoughts. It is known throughout the galaxy, and we are efficient and useful and forgettable, and our faces blur together and our names do not stick, and this is simply what we are. The words hung in the direction, the and in the air between them. Samuel's face did something complicated that she could not read. Who told you that? He asked, and his voice was strange, now tight with something she could not identify. Everyone, she said. Always, and it is not cruelty. It is simply fact, and we do not inspire remembering. Kethvari. He said her name like it mattered. like it was something precious that deserved to be spoken with care. "That is not a fact," he said slowly. "That is a choice, and every time someone decides you are not worth remembering, that is a choice they are making." She stared at him. "I do not understand." "I know," he said, and his voice was soft, now almost sad. "That is the worst part." He set down his container and turned to face her fully. "Let me ask you something," he said. "Do you remember my name?" "Of course," she said. "You are Samuel Reeves, and you work in Waste Reclamation Sector 3, and you come from a planet called Earth, and you have a sister named Maria, and your favorite food is something called spaghetti. And how did you remember all that?" She hesitated. "I chose to remember, and I always remember names because—" She stopped. Samuel was smiling at her, but it was not his usual easy smile. It was something deeper and more serious. "Because you choose to," he finished for her. "Because you decided that other beings are worth remembering, even when they do not remember you back." Her antenna quivered. "That is different," she said weakly. "How?" "Because I am Narration, and remembering is what I do, because no one will remember me, and it is my small rebellion against." She stopped again, because she was beginning to hear what she was saying. Samuel leaned forward. "HFY, you just describe exactly what I do, and I see you, and I choose to remember you, because you are worth remembering, and the only difference between us is that somewhere along the way someone convinced you that you were not allowed to be remembered." The words hit her like a hull breach. Like all the air in the corridor had suddenly vanished. "I do not." She started and then stopped because she did not know what she was trying to say. "The galaxy is full of beings who take the easy path," Samuel said, "and forgetting is easy and remembering takes effort, and most species do not want to put in that effort for someone they have decided does not matter." He reached out and very carefully placed his warm human hand over her small gray one. "But here is the thing, HFY and humans, we are stubborn, and we are inefficient, and when we decide someone matters, we do not forget, and we dig in our heels, and we remember their names and their favorite shifts and the moons on their homeworld, because that is what you do for people who matter." Tears were forming in HFY's large dark eyes. She had not cried in decades. She had not had a reason to cry. "But why?" she whispered. "Why would you decide that I matter?" Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "Because you were there," he said. "Simply because you introduced yourself, and you told me your name, and you were kind to a new human who did not know where anything was. And that was enough. And that was always enough." The tears spilled over and ran down her gray cheeks. Samuel did not look away. He did not release her hand. "You matter, HFY," he said. "You always did, and you just needed someone stubborn enough to prove it." She sat there in the cold corridor with tears streaming down her face and a human hand holding hers, and she felt the hollow, aching place inside her chest begin to fill with something warm and bright and terrifying. It was hope. It was connection. It was the feeling of being seen, and for the first time in 47 cycles, she began to believe that maybe the galaxy had been wrong about her all along. Word spread through the station, the way word always spreads in places where gossip is the only free entertainment. The human remembers the Meyer sheet. Started as a curiosity, and then became a fascination, and then became something that beings discussed in hushed tones like they were sharing a secret too strange to believe. The human from Waste Reclamation knows her name. He brings her warm drinks on his breaks. He sits with her in the maintenance corridors and talks to her like she is his frank HFY. Notice the stairs first. She had spent 47 cycles being invisible, and now suddenly beings were looking at her when she walked past. They were not looking through her the way they always had. They were looking at her like she was a puzzle they were trying to solve. A Vorthian engineer stopped her in the corridor one day. He was a large being with 4 eyes and mandibles that clicked when he was agitated, and he blocked her path like he had been waiting for her. "You," he said, "you are the GR Nareshi that the human speaks of." Kethvari's antenna twitched with surprise. I am Kethvari, yes. He speaks of you by name, the Vorthian said, and all four of his eyes blinked in sequence. He tells other humans about you, and he calls you his friend. Yes, Kethvari said, and she found that her voice did not waver. He does. But you are Marishi. Yes. The Vorthian's mandibles clicked rapidly. How does he remember you? It was a question Kethvari had been thinking about for months. She had turned it over in her mind during long night shifts and examined it from every angle, and she thought she finally understood the answer. I believe, she said slowly, that humans remember because they decide to, and they look at a being and they choose to see them. And they hear a name and they choose to hold it. She paused and let her antenna rise slightly. Where the galaxy sees forgettable, they see someone who has never been properly remembered, and they find that unacceptable. The Vorthian stared at her. With all four eyes, that seems inefficient, he said. Yes, she agreed. It is perhaps the most inefficient thing I have ever encountered. She walked away and left him clicking in confusion behind her. But she was smiling a small smile that felt strange on her face because she had so little practice with smiling. Truth was that she was only beginning to understand what made humans so different from every other species in the galaxy. It was not their strength, although they were surprisingly strong. It was not their intelligence, although they were clever in their own chaotic way. Was not their technology or their resilience or their strange warm blood. It was the way they carried names. Humans collected names like precious treasures. They stored them carefully in their minds and brought them out again and again. They used names constantly in conversation, even when it was not necessary, because to a human, a name was not just a label. It was a recognition of existence. It was a declaration that said you matter, and you are real, and I see how Kethvari had watched Samuel interact with other beings on the station, and she had noticed something remarkable. He remembered everyone. The Kavar one, the Deshan who ran the commissary, was named Korax, and he had a mate and 3 younglings, and his favorite color was blue. The maintenance chief, who had never once read her reports, was named Director Ven, and she had served on 4 different stations, and she was allergic to something called peanuts. The security officers and the engineers and the waste workers and the administrators, Samuel knew them all. He asked them questions about their lives, and he remembered the answers, and he used their names. Every time he spoke to them, it was exhausting to watch. It must have been exhausting to do, but he never stopped, and slowly, very slowly, Kethvari began to see something change on deck. 17 beings, who had never looked at her before, started nodding when she passed the Deshan commissary worker called her by name when she came for her meals. Director Ven actually read her latest report and approved the requisition for new filtration parts. What did you do? Kethvari asked Samuel one evening when they were sitting in their usual spot. What do? You mean, beings are seeing me now, she said. Beings who have looked through me for decades are suddenly noticing that I exist. Samuel took a sip of his kellic and smiled that crinkly smile. I might have mentioned you a few times. A few times. Okay. Maybe more than a few times, he admitted. And maybe I asked people if they knew who maintained the atmospheric systems, and when they said no, I told them your name, and maybe I suggested that they should thank you for keeping them alive. Kethvari's antenna flattened. Samuel. What? He said, and he did not look even slightly sorry. You do important work and people should know who you are, and I just helped them figure that out. You cannot make the entire station remember me. Watch me, he said. And there was something fierce in his voice now. You spent 47 cycles being invisible. Kethvari and I have been here for 6 months, and already half of Deck 17 knows your name. He leaned forward. Give me a year, and the whole station will know you, and give me 5 years, and you will never be forgotten again. She did not know what to say. She did not know what to do with this strange, stubborn, impossible human who had decided that she mattered and who was apparently willing to Wage a one-man campaign against the entire galaxy to prove it. Why? She asked again because she still did not fully understand. Why would you do this for me? Because someone should have done it a long time ago, Samuel said. Because you have spent your whole life being told you do not matter, and that was wrong, and I'm going to fix it. His eyes were bright with determination. That is what humans do, Kethvari, and when we see something broken, we fix it, and you were not broken. But the way the galaxy treated you was, and I'm not going to stand by and let that continue. She felt tears forming again. She seemed to cry more easily now that she had started. Humans are very strange. She said, Yeah, Samuel agreed. We really are. He held up his container. To being strange together. She raised her own container and touched it gently to his to being strange together. And somewhere deep inside her the last remnants of that hollow aching place filled with light. The emergency klaxons woke her from sleep, and for one terrible moment Kethvari did not know where she was. Then the words registered through the blaring alarms. Loss of pressure deck 17 section 4. Her section. Samuel's section. She was running before she fully realized she had left her quarters. The Marishi were not built for running with their small bodies and thin legs, but she ran anyway. She ran through corridors filled with flashing red lights and confused beings and the acrid smell of emergency sealant. She ran until her lungs burned with poorly filtered air and her legs screamed for her to stop. She did not stop. Section 4 was sealed behind emergency bulkheads when she arrived, and a crowd had already gathered. Theshans and Vorthians and humans and a dozen other species, all standing in clusters and speaking in urgent whispers. She pushed through them. What happened? She demanded. The human Samuel Reeves in waste reclamation, what happened to him? No. One answered her. No one even looked at her. They were all focused on the sealed bulkhead and the emergency teams beyond, and she was just a small gray Mareshi pushing against their legs, invisible, forgettable. Even now, even in the middle of a crisis. Something cracked inside her 47 cycles of being overlooked and ignored and forgotten. 6 months of finally being seen by one person who cared enough to remember her name. And now that person might be dead behind that bulkhead and no one would even tell her what happened. She opened her mouth to scream, to demand, to finally force them to see her. Let her through. The voice was loud and commanding, and it cut through the noise like a blade. Let her through, she is his friend. The crowd parted. A Theshan security officer was pushing toward her, and his scaled face was grim, but his eyes were focused directly on her. You are Kethvari, yes, he asked. Atmospheric maintenance. She stared at him. He knew her name. He was calling. For you, the officer said. Before they got him stabilized, he kept saying your name, and he made us repeat it back to make sure we remembered. Her legs almost gave out beneath her. Is he alive? He is alive, the officer said. The medical team is with him now, and come with me, and I will take you to him. He led her through the sealed bulkhead and into the damaged section beyond. The hull breach had sent shrapnel through the entire compartment, and the walls were scarred with impact marks. And the air smelled of burnt metal and sealant foam. Samuel was on the floor surrounded by medical personnel. He was pale, so pale, and there was blood on his face and his work. Suit was torn in a dozen places, but his chest was moving, he was breathing. She dropped to her knees beside him, and one of the medics tried to push her back. Let her stay, another medic said. He has been asking for her since we got here. Samuel's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, at first wandering around the room. Like he was searching for something, then they found her face, and he smiled. That same crinkly smile he always had, like nothing in the universe could keep him from being happy to see. Her Kethvari, he breathed, and his voice was barely a whisper. Do not speak, she said, and her own voice was shaking badly. Save your strength, and the medical team is here, and you are going to be fine. Had to tell them, he said like he had not heard her. Had to make sure they would let you in, and told them. Your name, and made them repeat it back. His hand moved weakly, and she caught it and held it between both of her own. Made them remember, he whispered. Tears were streaming down her face now, and she could not stop them and did not try to stop them. You stubborn, impossible human, she said. He laughed, and it turned into a cough, and the medics exchanged worried looks. Had to, he said when he could speak again. You deserve it, HFY, and you always did. She did not know what to say. She did not have words for what she was feeling, so she just held his hand and stayed with him while the medics worked. They stabilized him and loaded him onto a stretcher and carried him to the medical bay. She walked beside him the entire way. She would not let go of his hand. Being stared at her as she passed, and she did not care. Let them stare. Let them see the small gray Marishi who had finally found someone worth holding on to. The medical team worked on Samuel for 6 hours. HFY waited outside the surgery room the entire time. Other beings came by to check on him. The Veshan from the commissary brought her food that she did not eat. Director Ven stopped by and actually called her by name and asked if there was anything she needed. The security officer who had led her through the bulkhead came back twice to give her updates. They all knew her name now. Samuel had made sure of that. When the lead medic finally emerged, he found HFY still sitting in the same spot, with her antenna pressed flat and her eyes red from crying. He is going to be fine, the medic said. Humans are remarkably resilient, and he is asking for you. She was through the door before he finished speaking. Samuel was lying in a medical bed, surrounded by monitors and tubes, but his color was better, and his eyes were clear when they found her face. HFY, he said. Just her name. Just that one word. But he said it like it was the most important word in the universe. She crossed the room and took his hand again and sat in the chair beside his bed. You scared me, she said. Sorry. Do not be sorry. She said, just do not do it again. He smiled weakly. I will do my best. They sat in silence for a moment. The monitors beeped softly. The recycled air hummed through the vents. Outside the medical bay, the station continued its endless rotation around the distant star. Samuel, she said finally. Yeah, I will remember you, she said, and the words felt like a promise. I will remember. You, Samuel Reeves, and I will never forget you. He squeezed her hand. I know, he said. That is what friends do. Friends. She had never had a friend before. She had spent 47 cycles alone and invisible and forgotten, and then one stubborn, impossible human had decided that she mattered. He had said her name. He had chosen to see her. He had remembered her when no one else would, and he had made the entire station remember her too. That was what humans did. They refused to forget. They refused to let others be forgotten. They looked at the galaxy, and they saw everyone, and they collected names like precious treasures, and they held on to them forever. HFY had spent her whole life believing she was forgettable. She had accepted it as truth. She had made peace with it. But Samuel Reeves had shown her that forgettable was never a fact. It was always a choice. And humans, strange, wonderful, stubborn, impossible humans, they chose to remember. She sat by his bed and held his hand and watched him sleep, and she knew with absolute certainty that no matter what happened, no matter where the galaxy took them, she would never be invisible again, because somewhere out there one human had decided she was worth seeing, and he had spent 6 months proving it to everyone. That was the truth about humans that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. They did not just remember names. They made sure everyone else remembered too. And once a human decided you mattered, the whole universe would learn your name.